Chapter 6. The next day, I was rewarded with more wind than I needed, and even had to roll up the Genoa partway. The sky was gloomy and overcast, but I was pleased that the air smelled fresh and not tainted with the smoke from the fires that were raging down south. Off to the east, and all behind me, there wasn't much of anything as far as people were concerned. The only thing I saw was a glimmer of white, just a small speck, possibly another sailboat. Even with my binoculars, I couldn't make out what exactly it was. At our current speed, the odds were in our favor to reach my destination sometime tonight. Then we would be within a couple hours to my uncle's place. The only mystery was if Saul was even still there. After I moved out of Saul's, my contact with him went back to how it was before I moved in with him. My aunt was always very concerned with my diet, if I was getting enough exercise, and if I needed any clothes or cash. The care packages began showing up at my doorstep with a random assortment of items they felt I may need. The monthly calls also started again, but this time, I was the one getting them instead of my mom. Saul's questions were more pointed, however, and he had a new one each week. Did I have a grand plan for my life? What was it? What was I doing today so that the dream would be one step closer to becoming a reality tomorrow? Was I saving more than I was spending? Was my education progressing? If so, what books was I reading and how did I pick them? He followed up that question with a list of books he was reading and insisted that I read the same ones. But after Aunt Danielle died, Saul went a little nuts, completely deserting his old life by cutting all ties with people and changing his phone number. The last I talked to him, if you could call it that, was at her funeral. He was already checking out at that point, though. People were lucky if they could even get him to talk beyond just a few words. After that, I never received another package. When he was building their house, he built it to suit her. It was what they had spent so much of their time working for. And when it was finally within reach, she died, killed by a drunk driver who didn't even know what he had done until he sobered up in the hospital. He clearly had no remorse, and I was told that the guy was the life of the party in town, even after the accident. A couple months or so after my aunt's death, he disappeared and was never seen again. Rumors obviously stirred as to what happened to him, but by then I was occupied with other things. It wouldn't be a surprise if Saul had sold the house, moved, and started over. But despite that possibility, I still thought it would be my best option. With time to kill, I pulled out my backpack and went through my remaining supplies. With only a few meals left in hiking food, it might not be long before I was digging into Bruno's stash. I pulled out the 2 sections of the rifle that I had taken from my house and put them back together. As I slid the 2 pins back into place, I began to wonder if I was being paranoid by bringing it with me. I told myself that I brought it so that I would be able to hunt if needed. But would I be tempted to use it if threatened? I like to think that I wouldn't, but it was not something I wanted to find out. Using my thumb, I loaded the magazines to the max, one at a time, popping them in until both mags were full and the box of ammo was empty. Bruno sniffed the gun thoroughly, then sat, letting out a snort of disapproval. Once done, I sat and was hypnotized by the passing water and rocking waves until I finally dozed off. Over the next 8 hours, I started to suspect we were being followed. A glint of white on the horizon indicated another sailboat out there. Bruno spent most of the time looking in its direction and whimpering periodically. Whenever I spotted it, I quickly dug out my binoculars to get a better look, but by then it was lost behind a wave or out of sight. I could only assume that our sail was just as visible to whoever was out there. When I thought the coast was starting to look familiar, I sailed as close as I dared without risking bottoming out. The last thing I wanted to do was hit a rock with the keel. I knew that a boat this size needed roughly 5 feet of water or so just to float it. I knew the area well, but not from the water. Finally, I recognized the beach where I had spent much of my summer when I lived with Saul. The deserted small section of sand was a nice little secret tucked away. It was hardly ever crowded, even on nice summer days. Far from any major cities, the water was reasonably clean. I was so excited to have arrived that I resisted the urge to just sail the boat as close to the beach as I could. Not knowing what to expect, or even if I could find my uncle, I thought I'd better take precautions to keep the boat safe. It might be a while before I returned, and winter was right around the corner. The boat could not survive tucked away where the water froze over. The ice would crack its hull and sink it for sure, and I couldn't just park it anywhere. I wanted to preserve it in case I needed it again in the future. Not to mention, it was such a nice boat that it would be a shame to just trash it. Normally, by this time of the year, it would have been craned out of the water and stored safely on land in its cradle until the warm weather returned. But I didn't have a crane, so I had to make do. I found a spot that would most likely not freeze, but still offered a little protection by the high bluff, blocking strong winds from the east. The rest would be up to chance at this point. The odds of the boat surviving for a long period of time on the water were unlikely. I dropped the mainsail, rolled up the Genoa, and wrapped the sails in their UV cover. After gathering up all the anchors I had collected from the dinghy, I combined them at the bow of the boat. It wasn't much, but it was the best I could do to ensure the boat stay put for a long duration. Of course, as far as I knew, I may be coming right back depending on what I found at Saul's. Once it was clear the anchors had reached the bottom, the boat drifted slightly before turning into the wind like a giant weather vane. I was so relieved that I had made it, but at the same time I was exhausted. I resisted the temptation to sleep, and instead promised myself that if I continued I would be rewarded with a more comfortable bed, one that I wouldn't need to share with Bruno to stay warm. Part of me wanted to keep my floating sanctuary, and just try to make it on the water, but the winter would make that almost impossible. The area was known for being cold even in the summer months. So I got up and pulled all my supplies from the cabinets and arranged them on the table in the galley. I stuffed my things back in my pack and loaded up the dinghy that was still tied to the boat. I took a moment to say goodbye to yet another home. As I did with my apartment, I walked around the boat one last time, memorizing every detail from the white cushions down to the feel of the wood floor under my feet. I paused before climbing out with my hand still on the railing. I had a gripping feeling that I was forgetting something. When I glanced around the small cabin, I remembered the journal in my pack. I carefully returned it to the shelf where I had found it. Somehow it felt wrong to take it. It was as much a part of the boat as the mast or sails. Its fate should be the same as the boat's. Once I was satisfied with how the boat was buttoned up, I loaded Bruno into the dinghy and started to paddle to shore. Making my way around the front of the boat, I remembered when I first set eyes on it. I thought it looked like a large luxury boat, and it was. But after being on it for the past few days, battling the wind and the waves, it just didn't seem that big anymore. With its sails wrapped up and the lights off, it was restored to a peaceful sanctuary like when I found it in the city, asleep, resting, and waiting for the next journey. The open water didn't care how big a boat was. It was just like a woman in a lot of ways. It has a personality, and if she's in a bad mood, she would sink every boat in sight, no matter its size. Even after stepping onto dry land, I could still feel the sway of the boat under my feet. Regardless, I dragged the dinghy into a bush and hid it with some branches. I took one last look at the beach before starting the walk back west. Just as we were leaving, Bruno started barking frantically back at the water. But not at the boat, at least not our boat. Again, I caught a glimpse of that same white sail on the horizon. "Let's go," I shouted at Bruno, leaving him whimpering on the beach as I headed up the street. But before long, he was once again at my side. The walk to Saul's house was within a couple hours, but I was eager to be done with this journey, so I set a good pace. Most of the area was state land, and only used once in a while for hunting. The land was very stunning, but it was considered mostly wetlands. For that reason, it was protected, and people were unable to build on it. The land Saul owned was the only lot around that was usable. Before he owned it, it was an old rundown campground. On the far side of his property, some of the old buildings were still there, including an arcade and outhouses. The long walk was uneventful, thankfully, with not a soul in sight. Bruno blissfully trotted next to me as he had before, periodically stopping to inspect a twig or branch before catching up with me. Before long, we noticed what looked to be the entrance of the driveway to his house. For whatever reason, it was still mostly mud and gravel. Weeds had started to reclaim portions of it. It was so overgrown and unused, I wondered when someone last drove on it. The trees looked like they hadn't been trimmed in years. If I didn't know it was there, I could have easily missed it. The thick woods and rolling hills were two reasons Saul liked the property so much. It was a very wild-looking landscape. However, he was able to carve out a little spot for the house and left the rest for nature to run its course. Walking on the twisted driveway was almost as bad as walking through a meadow, stomping down all the tall grass and tromping through mud patches. Bruno hopped through it, trying to get a sense of where he was going. After darting ahead a few times, he eventually got tired and just followed me, trusting that I was not leading him off a cliff. It was a while before I even got close to the gate that blocked the path up to the main part of the house. Bruno and I rounded one of the many sharp curves in the driveway just before getting our first look at the entrance. Two large, proud stone pillars stood on either side of the wrought iron gate. I squinted at a glimmer of light coming just over the shoulder of the lion to the left. A timid wire sculpture peeked around its shoulder at whoever was approaching the driveway. I tried to remember if that was there when I had left, and was suddenly nervous that Saul might have sold the property. It didn't seem like something he'd have put there himself, though the sharp spikes next to the pillars did. They were certain to discourage even the most persistent burglar from attempting to scale it to gain access. The moss-covered pillars were solid stone set slightly forward from the actual gate. The tree branches were overgrown, partially blocking the statues that stood on top. Two carved lions guarded the entrance to the house. From the top, they kept watch, posed as if ready to pounce on anyone who entered. The gates loomed over me as I looked for a way over them. I walked to the sides to look from that angle, but I found none. I followed the wall until it transitioned from a stone wall to a metal fence that circled his property. He always said it was to be the very first of many Archer castles. The gate was controlled by something very similar to a garage door opener, and guests had to use the intercom system if they wanted access. But it was in almost as bad of shape as the driveway, and it gave off the appearance of being deliberately smashed. The pillars on the gate were easy enough for me to climb, but anything higher than 6 feet, and Bruno had trouble. So the only option left was to try to squeeze Bruno under a small part of the fence that a critter dug out long ago. Deciding I'd go first, I tossed my bag over the fence and climbed over easy enough. Bruno, for some reason, had trouble with small places and was reluctant to go, but after I presented him with the remainder of my granola bar, he was willing to brave it. Once he squeezed his way under the fence, we continued together down the rest of the driveway. This area was still considered wetlands, but he was able to cut a path for his driveway through it. The ground was saturated with moisture and was horrible for building on, but was perfect for willow trees, which reached over the driveway to one another and made the road feel like a tunnel. Darts of sunshine fought their way through the branches as the trees swayed, creating a very inviting light show. This was the only place on his property that they grew, and was a favorite spot for Danielle. She often went for walks up and down the long driveway, and swore she could hear them whisper to her on windy days. The beauty the willows provided came at a considerable expense. Like shedding dogs, they continually dropped branches that covered the ground. They constantly had to be trimmed and cleaned up. Saul had threatened to cut them down, but he was frequently met with considerable resistance from Danielle. The maintenance and cleaning that they required had long since been neglected. Once out of the line of the willows, the driveway opened up to a small circle of lawn in front of the house, which stood 3 stories tall and cast a shadow over us as we approached. It was mostly constructed of concrete with a stone facade. He had modeled it after castles that they visited on their honeymoon in Scotland. The courtyard was devastated by weeds that had choked out a once picturesque garden. Since its construction, ivy was planted all around the stone structure and had already grown over a third of the exterior. Not knowing what kind of welcome to expect, and feeling very nervous, I approached the entrance. It was capped with a dome ceiling made up of suspicious sculpted figurines all talking to one another while evaluating whoever was about to enter the house. The artist had a way of making them look very much alive, and I never could feel relaxed with them all watching me. The walls were crowned with an ornate molding that had lights to illuminate the dome ceiling at night and give it an even creepier glow, casting shadows on the faces of the sculptures. Stone benches stood on either side of the space, though I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to spend any time here, and to the front were the massive entry doors. As I stood in front of the entry, I felt like a child. The tall doors were made of red oak and banded with black iron belts. They had the look of being battle-tested. I wasn't sure if they were made to look old, or if they were actually salvaged off of an old castle. Neither would have surprised me. I smiled at the thick mat in front of the door that said, "Welcome." I felt anything but that as I stood in the entrance. As I reached for the door knocker clenched between the teeth of an iron lion, I locked eyes with it and cringed. The wild look in its eyes made me wonder what was going through Saul's head when he picked it out. Holding my breath, I gave it a firm swing. The loud, hollow sound filled the room and made me feel even smaller. Of course, I'm sure this was the reaction he wanted from people when they entered his house. He had an old-fashioned bolt to lock them on the inside. The only way to get through these doors was to be let in. Kicking them in was simply not an option. I stood there for an eternity and turned around to look at Bruno, who was still outside. With no reply, I gave the old knocker another couple swings, and again, nothing. I tried to listen to see if I could hear anything that would indicate life, but I was only greeted with silence. Disappointed, I turned and slowly walked back through the elaborate entrance to join Bruno outside. I looked at the giant walls that surrounded the courtyard and sighed. The house did resemble a castle, and not the ones that were really just big houses. Saul modeled his after battle-tested designs, which meant tall walls and high windows. The main house, garage, and guest house were all built in an oval shape, with large stone walls filling in any gaps between the buildings, making it look as if it was one giant structure. This, however, was where Danielle stepped in. She loved history and loved castles, but she would not live in a cold, dead tomb. She insisted on it being bright and chipper inside. So Saul built the house into the side of a hill. But the walls that surrounded the courtyard followed the slope downward and didn't interfere with the view from the house. Despite the high walls surrounding the courtyard, the sun still washed the side of the house throughout the day. Any windows outside of the wall were at least 2 stories up. The south side of the house, however, was full of windows and received all the light the sun had to offer. Danielle's reasoning behind this was that she was a flower that needed all the sunshine she could get. As a result, the master bedroom on the 3rd floor was made up of only glass and stone. It almost had the look of a greenhouse. For someone who didn't want a giant house, she had a lot of opinions on how it should look. The stone wall doubled as a way to connect the various sections of the house and the garage with a hallway, as well as seal off the courtyard and the garden within. The walls around the house blended right into the landscape from the ivy that was covering it. The top of the wall was 8 feet wide and had a walkway around it as well that tied into a large deck off the house's great room. All of this surrounded Saul's prized maze garden. To get from the entrance of the house's basement to the large wrought iron gate that separated the inside of the courtyard from the rest of the world, I would have to pass through the maze. The walls of the maze were made up of cone-shaped green shrubs that were narrow at the base but grew tall enough to block the view while inside the maze. They formed a wall at the base, but toward the top it just looked like a field of green spikes. I started walking around the exterior that towered over me at every point and got to the main gate of the courtyard. Along the way, I searched for a way over the wall, making mental notes on areas that had significant ivy growth and possible sections I could climb up. Somehow, I doubted I would find a ladder conveniently placed outside. The gate was the only access point to the garden, and was almost sealed shut from all the ivy that had grown up and around it. I would have a hard time getting it open, even if it wasn't locked. I continued around the outer wall, checking the service entrance to the garage as well as the main doors. No luck. As I walked around the perimeter, memories of the summer I spent working there came flooding in. I remembered that I always teased Saul about his garage, calling it his bunker. Its foundation was separate from the main house, but connected to the main part of the house via a tunnel that ran under the courtyard to the basement of the main part of the house. It was complete with a kitchen, bathroom, and various other rooms for storage. Saul always had a healthy respect for nature, and this also included nature's storms. In his earlier years, he once lived in a house that was relocated by a tornado that tore through their town. His bunker was the most elaborate storm shelter I had ever seen. He once laughed it off and said, "Oh well, every castle needs a dungeon." After a good look at the house and taking it all in, I said, "Why did he have to build a functioning castle?" It seemed silly to me, but it did turn it into a burglar's worst nightmare. I scanned the wall one more time, picking out a place that had a healthy rootstock for the ivy that just so happened to be next to one of the gutters that ran down the side of the house. Being that they were copper and of good quality, I knew they should be able to hold up to my weight. At least it would give me something to grab onto. After dropping my gear and taking a moment to stretch, I started to climb the wall. At the base, handholds were easy to find, either from the stone itself or the thick ivy. Digging through the leaves, I gripped the vines with one hand and gutter with the other. "It's been a couple years since I've climbed a tree," I yelled down to Bruno, as I struggled and fought my way up. He looked over the house, sniffing the leaves that covered the gray stone and snorting, clearly forming his own opinions. The branches of the ivy were as solid as a small tree, reluctant to give up their hold on the wall. I divided my weight between the downspout of the gutter and the ivy as I struggled up the wall. I firmly checked my grip and slowly shifted my weight as I searched for footing. The higher I went, the more deceiving the ivy. I gripped what seemed like a good section of the vine, but when I shifted my weight from the gutter and reached ever higher with my other hand, it suddenly released as I cat-scratched at the side of the house. I managed to hold on to the downspout before falling. From the ground, Bruno barked nervously as I shifted most of my weight on the slick gutter. Toward the top, however, the ivy pulled free easily. Digging my fingers into the cracks in the stone, I managed to reach the top and pull my weight over the edge onto the walkway on top. I took a breather and turned to look down at Bruno. He started to whimper uneasily as I moved out of sight down the wall. The garden on the other side was as overgrown as the rest of the yard. The only part that was not reclaimed was the stone path that flowed through the maze. From the top of the wall, the courtyard looked like a giant sea of various shades of green. I made my way across it and to the doors that entered the great room. As with the rest of the house, the doors towered above me, but with one difference. Instead of being solid wood, they were almost entirely made of glass, with only a grid pattern on them to block the sun. Bruno's whimpering turned into a nervous bark as I got even farther from him. The poor dog probably thought he was being left behind. I thought after all we had been through, he would know better by now. Hesitating, I gave the door a knock and listened. Nothing. One thing about Saul, once people were invited into his house, they were family. But if they stopped by unannounced, that was a different story. The last time I tried to contact him, I discovered his phone was disconnected, so barging in on him like this would for sure stir things up. I grabbed the knob and hesitated before giving it a turn. It was open. The ivy's grip on the door made it hard to push. I started to wonder how long it had been since the door was used. Ivy grew fast, but not overnight. "Hello?" I yelled and listened. Again, I yelled even louder. The only response I got was the sound of my own voice filling the room as it echoed back to me. I slowly stepped over the threshold, and more memories hit me. It looked as though no one had set foot in this room in years. The only things that had changed were the sheets that covered the unused furniture. The great room made me feel so insignificant. Its Gothic, growing vault ceiling stood 18 feet tall, with an oversized fireplace that made the house feel like it was made for a giant. It was every bit a great room, with stone walls and wide-planked red oak floors. The Venetian plaster on the ceiling had a brilliant shine that was enhanced by lights in the stonework, as well as two large wrought iron chandeliers. One corner of the room held Saul's prized grand piano. He always played it when he needed to relax or think. It shocked me to see that it was covered in a sheet, protecting it from dust. Every move I made could wake the dead. The large room delayed the echo of my steps and made it sound like I was being closely followed. Even though I knew better, I constantly looked over my shoulder as I crossed the room to the kitchen. The kitchen was no exception to the high standards the house set. It was not only the size, but the look of it, also. It was big enough to cook for an army, and at the same time still had a touch of elegance to it. From the thick black concrete counters to the stainless steel appliances, it was clear that Saul didn't pull any punches when he designed it. A layer of dust covered every surface. Just like the living room, it hadn't been touched in some time. "Hello?" I yelled again, but still no answer. I started to worry that Saul had since sold the property and no longer lived here, but I soon found a picture of him and Danielle on the wall. Frustrated, I pushed through the kitchen and made my way to the front door, flipping light switches with no result as I went. The house was powered with a large solar array on the property because it was cheaper than trying to run power lines out to the house. As a result, the house was self-sufficient. Why the power was off now was still a mystery to me. The natural light became scarce the closer I got to the front doors. I resorted to feeling my way through the halls until I found myself standing in front of the main entrance. I wondered why Saul needed to have a front door that could keep out King Kong. Feeling around, my hands gripped the iron bolt that locked the door. After sliding back the bolt, I gave the huge doors a good yank. As they slowly moved, the hinges complained and creaked until they were fully open and letting in much-needed fresh air. The little light that was left in the day flooded the entrance and revealed the dust in the air. The black and white marble floor was also coated with an unflattering haze. "Bruno, come!" I yelled as I walked back around the wall to retrieve my gear. Now that I was here, and an actual bed was so close it seemed to take forever for Bruno to reach me. "Bruno, hurry up!" I yelled, picking up the pace myself. Finally, I saw Bruno round one of the corners of the wall. He got within arm's reach of me and came to a screeching halt before flaring his teeth and pacing back and forth, barking like I was a complete stranger. The scruff of his neck thickened as his fur rose. His back feet scratched at the earth, tossing up chunks of grass and dirt as he snorted and snapped his white teeth like a rabid dog. When I realized he was not actually barking at me, I turned to meet whatever or whoever was there, but not before I felt a sharp pain on the side of my head. With my head spinning and off balance, I slumped over on the wall. I felt myself slide down the stone. Darkness washed over me, and everything, including Bruno's barking, faded.